Hello and welcome to another video introducing you to the features of the Gamepad Navigator. Check out the introduction video linked in the description if you need more background on what the Gamepad Navigator is or does. In this video, I'll take you through the settings page for the Gamepad Navigator. All navigation and inputs will be performed using the Gamepad Navigator and a gamepad. On the bottom of the screen, you can see an on-screen representation of my gamepad, which will highlight buttons and move sticks to show you what I'm doing. The easiest way to open the settings page is to use the badge button, which is usually an icon representing the console or controller manufacturer, such as the PlayStation logo or Xbox logo. By default, the badge button opens the settings menu, which we see here. At the top of the page are preferences that apply to all bindings, such as whether to vibrate the controller, and then behavior of the extension itself. I'll go briefly through a few key ones. For example, you can see the open settings on startup flag controls whether or not we open the settings page if no other windows are available. We do this because you have to have a window open to use the Gamepad Navigator. And so we want to make sure that by default you have a window open and that you can control your browser. If you don't like this, if you have another way of ensuring that a window is open that you can control, you can turn this off. So let's go through how you actually do change a setting. I'm going to show you using bumpers to move through. You can see I can click on these toggles, and now you see that the buttons down here are now available. When I've already saved the settings that appear on screen, there's nothing to save, there's nothing to discard. So those buttons are disabled. But once I make a change, those buttons are available. So if I were to discard changes, everything goes back to the way it was. I'll give you an example with vibrate because you can kind of hear it. When I go up to the top, if I can't go any further, the controller will vibrate unless I go through and change that behavior. And now when I scroll up, there is no vibration. I kind of like that, so I'm going to change it back, and you'll get to see again. I'm using the bumpers to navigate and using the click button, which is the bottom button on the right-hand cluster of buttons, to hit the buttons. And if you want more examples of the basic navigation that I'm using here, you probably should check out the video on navigating within a page, where I cover a lot of this stuff. So we've just gotten through the preferences, which are for all bindings or for the extension itself. Now we have bindings. Binding is just an association between an input, something you press, and then an action, something that you want to have done when you press the button. This is a list that you can add and remove items to. You navigate using the bumpers. I'll show you in a minute that each of these ones with configurable options has a gear icon that you can click on to open and see some more options that we're going to check out in a minute. But let's start with something that's easy, which is just adding a new action. So select boxes use a modal to let you control them because they're otherwise kind of inaccessible. So that is the content of the select box that I was just focused on. And I can use the D-pad to move through the list of options. This is all the controls that are not already in use. So for example, if I've already bound a button to an action, I can't use it for another action. And so this list will get smaller as you add new bindings. So let's say, for example, I want to use the left trigger. I use the D-pad to highlight that and then use the click button to click that. And now I have to select an action. You can see that the add binding button is still not available because I haven't selected an action. So let's just say duplicate the current tab, click add binding, and now if I were to scroll down, there's a lot of bindings, so it'll take a minute. When the left trigger is pressed, duplicate the current tab. I'm going to save those changes, and now I'm going to press the left trigger. Ta-da! The new binding works. It duplicated the existing window. I'm going to close this with the action launcher. If you want more information on the action launcher, check out our video on navigating between pages, where we go through a lot of examples with this. Right, so now we're back where we were. Let's look at what it takes to remove a binding. You can see the button next to each of these, whether or not they're configurable. There's a remove binding button. I'm just going to click that to remove the binding we just added. And then I'm going to click Save Changes so that I'm back to the defaults. Now let's go through how you would configure a binding. Some of these have parameters that you can change that control the way they work. Let's go through the left bumper, which I think will be interesting. So the only option supported here is the repeat rate, but this is a very important one. This is a new feature in version 1.0. You can control how often or whether an item repeats. So, for example, if you prefer to click the bumper every time you want to move forward to the next focusable element, you can, I'm using the D-pad arrows here to turn it down to 0, which would mean do not repeat. Or I could turn it back to the default, and that's every half a second. If I hold down the button, it will repeat. So that is a key feature of 1.0, that you can control whether most things repeat. Some things like a click, it doesn't make sense to repeat, but a lot of things like a bumper or sending a key, you might want it to repeat. This is also how our arrow navigation works. You can see that that repeats. That's because the binding a little further down, I'll go down and show you, is actually configured to repeat, and you can control whether or not it repeats. You can see in this example there's also another option for when you send a key, you can determine which key you send. And most of these are very similar per action. You have options on what you can do. Most of the time it's just whether or not to repeat, but you'll see as you start working with bindings, each of them have a description and tell you what the parameter does, and when there's a range control, like the rate that we saw, or like this polling frequency, we can just use the up and down arrows or the left and right arrows to change it. So that was adding a binding, removing a binding. I just wanted to briefly talk about axes. I use the word axes because the Gamepad API that we built on top of, uses the word. All it means is something that can move from one direction to another, like a thumbstick or a steering wheel. And for the most part, you have 2 axes per thumbstick. One is horizontal, one is vertical. So that's the way we've described them here. The only thumbstick that's bound by default, you can see I'm using it right now, is scrolling vertically. I still have 3 available on this model. I could do something with the horizontal axis, something with on the left stick, and I can use either on the right stick. I wanted to briefly mention that the reason we don't have anything bound to the horizontal axis is that in practice it was too easy to accidentally trigger an unwanted action. When trying to move up and down, you would accidentally trigger an action on the left stick. So I intentionally left everything out. You can choose, though, to add something. Let's try. Right. You can choose to add something if you want. There are less actions for thumbsticks, but there are things like scrolling and zooming that make sense to do with an analog control that has a range of options. So that is a quick demo of the settings page, which lets you control how the Gamepad Navigator works. And these settings are all saved to what's called local storage. It means that whether you restart your browser or not, your settings will work across all windows. And settings are also picked up if you have multiple windows open and you save changes to your settings. Each of the windows will be aware of the changes that you've made. So I hope that you will be able to set up the Gamepad Navigator like you want, and check out the rest of the series for more information on using the Gamepad Navigator.